we'll open a bit of time for question and answers at the end. We're live on Facebook.
Are we?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. All right. I'm so excited. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our discussion with Ayesha Harruna Attah, who is the author of The 100 Wells of Salaga. And I have the great pleasure, English. I have the great pleasure of introducing tonight's guest. And this is her bio. I love to read authors' bios, especially Black girl, because Black girls are Black girl magic. And you'll see when you read this bio as well. Ayesha Harruna Attah grew up in Accra, Ghana, and was educated at Mount Holyoke College, Columbia University, and New York University. She's the author of Hamilton Rain, which was nominated for the 2010 Commonwealth Writers' Prize. Give me high five, somebody. Saturday Shadows, which was shortlisted for the Kwani Manuscript Project in 2013. The 100 Wells of Salaga, which has been translated into 4 languages, and a first novel for adults, The Deep Blue, which is forthcoming in October 2020. And Ayesha is our guest for today, and we're going to be discussing The 100 Wells of Salaga, aka the book that put the pre-colonial and I through everything. Welcome, Ayesha.
I have animals over here who tend to interrupt at key moments, so bear with.
Welcome to the Cheeky Natives, and welcome. I'm so grateful for the pandemic on one front, because I feel that because we're all somewhat locked in, we're able to have these conversations, which would seem a little bit difficult with our busy lives, right? So we're so grateful that we're able to connect, across countries and just have this conversation. But also I think this moment is just for us to honor you for your writing. I think The 100 Wells is a really fantastic book. But more importantly, I want us to, spend a little bit of time at the end to speak about your new book, which is coming out in a month. Yeah. And just we're already saying we're excited to have you back for that book. We're just excited to have you back for that book. But we thought it would be a great opportunity for us to introduce people to your writing by talking about The 100 Wells. And so that by the time your new book comes out, everyone is lining up to get a copy of that book as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on.
I have so much that I want to talk about with The 100 Wells. Y'all don't even know. Okay. Okay. Whew, Ayesha, there are so many themes, right? This book is quite a complex. It's a complex book, and it's quite a complex undertaking as well. And I want to talk about that because I think people don't often think about the craftsmanship that is writing. Okay, so this is historical fiction. This is beautifully researched and contextual historical fiction. And I'm curious about historical fiction as the basis on which you explore the complexities of our history. Why historical fiction? You could have, I don't know, done anything, but you chose to use historical fiction, which required all of this research, all of this background work, and use that as I guess the basis, the foundation for these complex histories that you urge us to explore in the story.
I started out with the character. So I don't think I set out to write a historical fiction. I set out to write a story about my ancestor, who I had learned was enslaved. So she's the person who came to me first. And I guess just by being a historical figure, someone who's lived through time, that set the book in a certain space, in a certain genre. But when I started attempting to write this book, which was maybe in 2011, 12, I actually had a character who was set in present day, who fell in a well and went back in time to meet her ancestor and found out that these events had happened to her ancestor. So that was the first iteration of the book. And I actually wrote quite a bit of it, and it came off as sort of like a teen magical realism type of book with historical fiction elements, but the world wasn't coming together. So I shelved that and then immersed myself in more research. So as I was writing the first book, I was doing my research, but this time I just fully immersed myself in the research without writing. And then as I was doing that research, some of the characters began to develop, like Wurche developed as a result of research. And once I had the idea of Wurche in mind and I knew I'd write about my ancestor, the two worlds came together, and then it was just a question of, pulling out their stories. And the stories just happened to be set in the past. But I think as a person, as a writer, I'm very fascinated by who we are, where we've come from, the journeys that we've been on, why certain things aren't talked about, why certain things are secret. And so these are the things that fascinates me, and that's probably why I wrote a historical fiction in the end, because I have so many questions. So many questions.
I mean, just to expand a little bit on that, right? I think that there is a complicity that you explore in the book. There is a complicity of Africans in not only the transatlantic slave, but also in the internal slavery that takes place. And when I think of the complex histories that you explore, there is a complicity that you then hold us to account in this book. And so I want to know what you hoped to come out of that holding to account, right? And I mean, I was saying to Tlokonolo earlier that often, we've seen the diaspora wars happening on social media, and something that comes up often is that the idea of the complicity of Africans in the slave trade, right? And this is something that I feel like you ask a lot of questions about African complicity in this book, and I want to know what was the thinking around that, but also what kind of conversation you hoped that would spark.
So I think when I set to write this book, I just wanted to write about my grandmother. Mm-hmm. I said that before. I just wanted to write about this ancestor who had been enslaved. Mm-hmm. So I wasn't even writing about the complicity of Africans in the slave trade at that point. I just wanted to find out about this woman whom everyone called a slave. Like asked around, what's her name? Nobody could tell me. So she was the impetus for even starting this whole project. But once I did begin to dig a little deeper, who did she end up with, without giving away too much, because I don't know how many people have read the book. And the fact that I'm here today is because of the person she ended up with. So in thinking about that figure, that person who she ends up with, it began to turn wheels in my mind, like, who was this person? Who are these people who would actually capture other people and then marry them or turn them into whatever they wanted to? And so those questions were running through my mind. And then I also began to realize that a lot of my education was actually false, because in all the stories that I'd been told, or in all the history lessons that I knew about, it was a European exploitation of Africans across the ocean. And yet, if you start picking things apart, Europeans mostly stayed on the coast of West Africa. I can't talk much about, Angola and the Congo and those regions further south, because I haven't done any research into those areas. But in West Africa, it's clear when you come to Ghana, the slave castles, the so-called slave castles, are on the coast. And beyond that, you don't have that European penetration. And yet, a lot of the people who ended up in the Americas were from the interior. So then that begged the question, how did people get from the interior to these slave castles when Europeans weren't going inside? Like, if they did, they would die by the numbers. Malaria and all sorts of disease would just fell them. So who was doing that work of being the middleman? So all these questions came up, and I think my goal was to start talking about them. I don't think I have answers. I don't think I have healing powers, but I think these questions and conversations around these questions have the potential to heal, because the wounds of all of these things are still there. And I think also the other conversation starter I wanted to have was that as you mentioned, on social media, in the general discourse, there's a tendency to blame, like, Africans did this work of, selling off their own. And yet even on the continent, there were people who were victims too. So as people in the Americas were being forced to suffer chattel slavery, there were people on the continent who were also enslaved, and their lives may have been slightly better. I say slightly because if you're enslaved, you're enslaved. You're not in charge of your own life and destiny. But then there were things like you could marry into families, you could um, even own land, you could become a king or a queen or a chief in some instances. So there were differences. And yet, on both sides of the ocean, people were enslaved. So I think that is a conversation starter and a conversation that needs to be had as well. It wasn't just one directional. People on the continent were also suffering. So I think that was a second goal, just starting the conversation about how we were complicit, why we're complicit, and then the fact that people on the continent also suffered this terrible system from this terrible system.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I wanted to speak a little bit about the writing style, right? I find that, and I hate using this term, but I feel like we use it a lot, right? There was a lot of humanizing that you were doing in the book, right? And the humanizing was of our people, right? You not once in the book do you refer to our people as Black people, but you bring whiteness into the book to speak about the construction of whiteness, which then led to the subordination of Blackness. And I was really interested in that like literary move. Why was it important for you to tussle out that, to be like, these are our people, we're going to talk about our cultures, our languages, our traditions, our religions, but I'm not going to name them. I'm going to name where they come from and where they're located, but they're not going to be named as Black. So I wanted to know, a little bit about that decision in your writing.
I think I wanted the reader to be as submerged and immersed as possible, as fully submerged and fully immersed as possible in this world. And I've heard people say this, and I've experienced this as well, like the awareness of who you are. In Southern Africa, I know it's a little different, but for West Africans, and Panashi Chugumati has an excellent essay about this, like when people say, I didn't become Black until I went to X, Y, and Z. And it is true, because in West Africa, we haven't experienced systems of apartheid in the same way that people have in Southern Africa and in the Americas. So that awareness of skin color, yes, there are gradations, and being a dark-skinned person, I suffered this as a child, where like the light-skinned people were always being treated better than I was in school. But that awareness of being Black or being African didn't come until I was sort of pulled out of it. And I read a lot, I watched films, so I did know what my brothers and sisters in the diaspora were going through, but you don't really know until you've experienced yourself, until you're walking down the street and somebody clutches their purse because of your skin color. If you haven't experienced it for real, like, you don't know what that is like. You can empathize, but to actually experience it, that happened when I was plucked out. So I think I wanted to have these characters, be as innocent as possible, as natural as possible, as they would be in this world where they haven't experienced other people. So they would probably see things along ethnic lines, like we are the people with the 3 scars versus those people there. And then for some people like Wurche, who'd had more exposure, skin color would be more obvious. But for Aminah, for instance, it would be the people coming in the caravan in their shades of brown, but seeing a white person would be totally earth-shattering. Like, who is this person? And there's another book that I think does this really well. It's by a writer called Leonora Miano. She's Cameroonian. It's called Seasons of the Shadow. I might be butchering the title, but it's also set in the 1800s, and is the encounter of Cameroonian people with, they call them hen-footed people, because to them, wearing shoes was reminiscent of having feet shaped like a hen's. So yeah, to be as real and as true as possible, I think I had to really put myself in the skins of people in that era. And if you haven't experienced certain things, you're not going to have the lens of seeing things by skin color. There are other markers to show identity.
Mm.
If that answers the question.
Yes.
There's an exploration of friendship and kinship, and in reading this, I actually even said this earlier to Klokonolo, you know, in looking at the relationship between Wurche and Aminah, I think that they have somewhat of a friendship, but I wonder how much of a friendship can exist with those power dynamics in place. So how much of a friendship and a kinship can you have in somebody whom you own, you know? And I wanted to explore that relationship a little bit more. Were they friends? What was the relationship there? But also, what is the commentary around friendship in unequal power dynamics? Because you think of how people will say, oh, so we'll have people we call domestic workers in South Africa, and they'll say, so like your house help, and they'll say, she's like family to me, she's like my family. And I wonder how I think that's a modern day iteration of this question, but how much friendship and kinship can exist when inevitably the power dynamics are skewed, right?
Yeah.
Like, I have to be nice to you because you're my employer, you're not going to pay me.
Yeah, I don't think I have the answer to that question, but I wanted to explore that as well, because in Ghana it's the same thing. That domestic a house help relationship with the madam we have in Ghana, we have over here, I think all across the continent. And there are some vestiges of this system that still exist, because you hear horror stories about domestics not being paid well, being abused, and I think that harkens from this era that I write about. But I think Wurche and Aminah's relationship is also an interesting one, because there is a certain need that Wurche has for Aminah. Like, Wurche can't she almost can't survive without Aminah. She's not very maternal, and Aminah is the one who ends up taking care of Wumpuni, Wurche's son. Aminah is the one who is running the business that Wurche eventually sets up. So it's hard to describe it as a friendship, as a full-fledged friendship, but there's definitely codependency. And Aminah she belongs to Wurche. She is Wurche's slave. So they're forced to have that relationship in because of that. But there's a point where Aminah could break things off and it's like Wurche's weakest point, and she could go, and yet she stays. And to me, that was interesting. That's where you find that maybe Aminah sees Wurche as a friend despite it all. Aminah sees Wurche as somebody to have compassion for, that in other circumstances that they could be friends. And in my mind, Aminah asked Wurche at some point if she can come back. And Wurche says yes. So in my mind, like, once that link of slave and master are taken away, then there's potential for a friendship to develop. But then at the same time, it's one of those things that, can Aminah ever forget that this is a woman who once owned her? I don't know.
I suppose thinking about kingship particularly, I think about, one of the things that I really enjoyed about the book was the queerness of it all, right? Mm-hmm. But also how, like, the queerness of it was not in terms of, like, trying to pathologize, right? Mm-hmm. It was just like this is how people feel, and this is how people want to explore their feelings, right? So there was also not a naming, so to say, right? Because, like, there wasn't a labeling, but we definitely were working with Wurche and thinking about, oh my gosh, like, okay, this is it. Okay, what's happening? Mm-hmm. But also, for me, what was interesting about it is also thinking about, like, the socialization of society, because as much as there was an exploration of the feelings, there was also a consciousness of, like, the period, the time, the society we were in, and how nobody actually said the words that this is wrong, but we know because of how society is ordered that this is wrong. And connected to that is thinking about, like, the kingship that sort of almost develops between Aminah and Wurche, and how Wurche is constantly reeling herself back and saying, oh, hold up, like this, in this society, this doesn't work. I want to, but I can't. And I wanted to know why it was important for you to explore that exploration. Because on the one hand, I was like, thank you for writing against the narrative that this came as a result of people coming onto the continent, because that is just simply not true.
Yeah. Yeah, I have really interesting conversations with my father, who is he's a journalist in Ghana as well, and he's Muslim, and my mother is Christian. So already, like, I grew up in a household where they didn't impose either of their religions on me or my sister. So I think that lent me a certain open-mindedness from a very young age. So I was always full of questions. Like, I'd ask my mother, like, so is daddy going to go to hell if he doesn't believe in Jesus, or vice versa, you know? And then on the subject of queerness, my dad was telling me that in Ghana in the 1960s, when he was coming of age, there were men who would dress up in drag in northern Ghana, which is very Muslim. This is like Senegal. I don't know if you have any idea. Think of Mali, think of Senegal, northern Nigeria. Northern Ghana is the same thing. This is a culture where it's very Muslim, it's very patriarchal now. But yeah, there were these cross-dressers who would go around selling things and nobody judged them, and they were sort of accepted. So that struck me as well, how our societies have really changed, and with the injection of certain new religions and things like that, we become just crazy and start to finger point and to say certain things are wrong. While if you went back into the past, just a few years ago, this is 40 years ago, there were cross-dressers who were allowed to live and to explore their sexuality. And he didn't even, did he have a word for it? I don't remember there being a specific word for it. But he said he felt a bit of pity for them because there was a lot of sadness around them as well. And but people let them be. And then there's a wonderful essay collection by, forget the authors, the editors, but it was published by Cassava Republic about Nigeria's queer women. And you hear a lot of the story. She called me woman.
No, she called me woman. She called me woman.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that too also peels back some of the historical layers. It came after the Hundred Wells of Salaga, or maybe it was concurrent. I can't remember when it was published. I think it was around the same time. But I read it after my book was published. And it was almost like a validation of the fact that people in all their forms and with all their desires and with the range of like ways of being have existed for forever. And in places where it's hard to, in places like northern Nigeria and northern Ghana, where it's hard to express one's sexuality fully, the fact that people have existed like this, to me, is like proof that people should just stop being crazy. Like, we come in all shapes and sizes and colors. So I wanted to talk about that, but same with the skin color. I didn't want it to be a thing where we put a label on it, because I think people have always lived their lives as well. A lot of people live their lives quietly, and in a way, I think Wurche does that from when she was a little girl. And the other thing was, I wanted to talk about female sexuality, which is not a black and white thing. It's actually a spectrum. So even Aminah, even though she doesn't quite have feelings, she doesn't even explore them if she has them. I don't know if she has them towards Wurche or not. Wurche is the one who's like, should I not? But if Aminah could let herself go there, we might be surprised as readers, but she can't let herself go there because of the situation in which she finds herself in, which is that she is somebody's enslaved person. She asks questions like that all the time, like, am I even allowed to have a friend? So if she can't even have a friend, can she even explore beyond that, explore her sexuality? So I don't know. I've been asked that question once in a forum, like, why didn't I let Wurche and Aminah have the full-blown friendship? in all its senses and all its different connotations and meanings. But I think it's just because of the position Aminah found herself in. She didn't know she could even have a friend. So how much more a relationship with the woman who owned her?
I suppose there's a related question, because I trigger warning to everybody who's listening. This is about homophobic violence. We woke up yesterday to a 14-year-old girl who identified as lesbian being killed for being lesbian. And it took me back to think about Fatima, right? And think about the context in which you're writing. Like, and wondering if you wonder what happened to Fatima.
I think there was less violence around such things in those days. I think she might have been just sent off, packed off with her mother, like, just take your child and go. But I don't think it would have been a violent situation. Like, when I think about, like, my father telling me that in the 1960s there were cross dressers. Right now, if you have cross dressers in the same region, I think there's more likely to be violence than the people's reactions 40 years ago. So I think we are becoming more violent, and I don't know if it's a result of the fact that we're talking about it more, and if it's the fact that more people can be open. I was watching Disclosure, which is an excellent documentary, amazing. And I think somebody was saying that with more exposure, there will be more violence.
More violence,
so,
yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that there's an interesting exploration that you do in the book, and that's really about how people's ideas of freedom are also formed by the class location that they're in, right? So Wurche wants to be able to dictate, military tactics. She wants to sit at the court, and she believes that she has something to offer, which she does. Whereas Aminah just wants to be free in the truest sense of the word. And there's a commentary around how your idea of freedom is so deeply related to class position or to class location, right? And I think that that's an interesting concept to explore, right? Because here are these two Black women in 18th century Ghana who have very different ideas of what freedom looks like. And that is to say that freedom is not this monolithic idea for all Black people everywhere in all parts of the world, and not even in your own locality, right? And I want to explore that relationship between your idea of what it means to be free and that class position, and what that means in practicality for these two characters.
So when I was doing my research, why Wurche was born was, I found this phrase in one of my books, one of the research books, which said, a princess in Gonja society, so the Gonjas are Wurche's ethnic group, a princess could choose whomever she wanted to be her lover, even if you were already married to somebody else. So in my notes, I was like, wow, this is one free person. She can do whatever she likes. That's one idea of freedom, the ability to do what one pleases without repercussions. You can break a marriage and it's good, you're fine because you want to do this. So I sought to write about the freest woman in this society, almost as a foil to Aminah's character, who is enslaved. We know from the get-go, well, not from the get-go, but we know very soon that her freedom is taken away from her. So once I did start writing, that idea sort of got turned on its head, because is Wurche really a free woman? You begin to realize that not quite, she can't exert as much influence as she wants to. She can't marry who she wants to. She can't do whatever she wants to, contrary to what one would have thought. And also because she's a royal. If you are royal, in certain ways, you're a slave to the state. You're not free either. Like, a lot of people see royalty as a thing, like to be a king or a queen is a thing to aspire to. Yeah. And it's an unpopular opinion, but like, don't call me queen, don't call me king. I don't buy into it, because it comes with its own set of, like, some should rule and some should not. And in any case, the idea behind being a king is to be a servant of the state. So yeah, in writing the book, these are ideas that actually came to the fore. Like, I thought Wurche would be the freest woman in her society, but in the end, she wasn't. And when it comes down to it, when Aminah is able to break free, she can do whatever she wants. The sky is the limit for her, you know. So it's an interesting dynamic to explore. And she's a commoner. And yet the freedom she has is the freedom she eventually takes for herself is way greater than that of Wurche's.
I wanted to speak a little bit about like the Lose Your Mother. I thought a lot about Saidiya Hartman's Lose Your Mother when I was reading The 100 Wells. And I wanted to speak a little bit about that because we know that there are tragic events that happen, and these tragic events take us to, you know, sort of the constant thinking and constant wondering about like what it feels like to lose your mother, but what life your mother may have carved out for herself if she is or had she been alive, right? And I wanted to know what your thoughts are or any meditation about the interaction of thinking about like how Lose Your Mother plays a role in 100 Wells of Salaga.
I read Lose Your Mother a long time ago. So I have a C for a brain, so I cannot remember all the details. But I think that idea of just exploration, of going back to find out that, it's in French now. Yes, that search for home is probably what pushed me to write the 100 Wells of Salaga, because even though I grew up in a place that I call home, a place where I know where my family is from, supposedly, when I did this work of going back, there were actually parts of me that were rootless, that had been plucked also from somewhere. So I think we're doing similar work. Saidiya through nonfiction and like tracing, going to the castles, and like I think she goes up to the north as well, right? She goes to
she does. Yes.
And so she's using nonfiction, and we're traveling similar paths. But my journey probably starts in the hinterlands, and then the references to the coast. We don't quite make it to the coast ever. They're just references, like Wurche's brother goes to the coast to try to talk to the governor. They're the Ashanti people or Asante people who are close, or the middlemen, the brokers between the coast and between where most of these events take place. So we're navigating similar spaces, and the impetus is probably similar, but we use different media. And I think it's a search for home for me too. Yeah, that's the best answer I can come up with.
I love that. I love the idea of you saying it's a search for home for you too.
I think that there's something that happens in the book that I find interesting, because this book is also in many ways a coming of age for Aminah. But what happens is, in the coming of age, I think that she's romanticized a lot of things about home and about the relationships of home in ways that I think you can only do when you're far away from home, because that's what nostalgia makes you do. And there is a realization that she has about the relationship between her mother and her father, and what intimacy looks like. And I think that is such a powerful moment in the book, because we start to see Aminah almost have to make peace with what her remembering may be and what the reality may have been, but also start to humanize. And I also hate this word, humanize, but also start to, I think it's really important in the context of Black mothers that we speak about that, because I think often people seem to think of their mothers as like superheroes who don't feel hurt, who don't feel harm, who were able to just do these like superhero things with bare minimum resources, and they were just able to soldier through it, and they never felt pain and they never felt harm. But she realizes that in her parents' relationship, her mother may not have always been happy, and that there may not have always been intimacy, and there may not have always been joy. And I think that in the nostalgia that Aminah experiences, it's really poignant that you chose to write that moment in to be such a vivid remembering and such a vivid moment for her. And I want us to talk a little bit about that moment in which you begin to realize that the things that we may have idolized about our parents may not necessarily be true.
Mm-hmm. You're hitting the nail on the head, because I think as children, the idea for us, say for families in which there's an obvious, abuse, and there's obvious things that children can't even miss. Say for those kinds of situations, we tend to idealize our parents. Like, you want to get, at least I did. I wanted to have a marriage like my parents. They seem like they're the best friends ever. Like, I wanted a man just like my dad. I wanted to be just like my mother. And then as you grow up, you begin to see the clockwork of marriage, the internal workings of marriage, and you see everything is not so perfect. Some things that you thought were actually like really, really wonderful on the surface, like you dig a little deeper and you realize actually somebody sacrificed this part of themselves to make this part of the marriage work. Or there's certain things that you don't even know happened before your parents got together, and like when you do hear the stories, you're like, whoa, this is crazy. So I think Aminah, she's doing this from a distance, and she's able to do what I'm gonna talk about, a book I'm reading to relate to what she does. So I'm reading Women Who Run with the Wolves, and she talks about going into a cave to find your wild woman. And it's a moment that gives you clarity and makes certain things very, very clear. So I think Aminah, in her journey with Wurche, in her journey with Wumpini, is able to also find her wild woman. She's able to find the essence of who she is. And she begins to realize, actually, my parents, whom I had idolized, they're actually not that perfect. Because why would he have married another woman? Why would he have gone and left us? Even though the culture says you should do this, you could have stayed with one wife. Because there are instances. People here in Senegal drive me crazy, because like the men here, they're like, yeah, we can marry a second wife, sorry. So as soon as they get a little money in their pockets, it's like, it's time to get married. But you don't have to do that. You can stay married to one person. It's okay. And I know, like in my own family, there were people who were monogamous, even though polygamy was allowed. So yeah, she begins to take apart her own family, and she's realizing that some of the things she's been sold or told are half-truths or untruths. And I think I wanted a book that would do it all and be real, I wanted to get rid of the fantasies that we're sold as girls, especially concerning marriage. Because I think even now there's a tendency to push women into marriage. Like, why aren't you married? Why aren't you married? Like, even at age 40, why aren't you married? You should find somebody and settle down. And then you find out like the whole institution of marriage is rigged once you get into it, unless you can build something different for yourself. But if you follow everybody else's prescriptions, it's a mess. Big mess. Yeah.
I also wanted to talk about, I think that Wurche for me is like someone who tries to defy patriarchy, right? By carving out a freedom for herself. I think that the decision that she makes from a very young age is to say, I know my place in the world and I'm going to create and carve out this place in the world. I know what society says I'm supposed to do, but I'm not going to do that. And there are many moments in the book where we see her exercise the agency in that way. And I suppose I wanted to ask, like, what was the commentary behind that, right? Particularly thinking about like the 18th hundreds, right? And thinking about the time that we're in, what was the commentary there, right? Like, because I think that when we think about like the way history has been told, we, and particularly Black women, would have been in some form of subjugation. But Wurche allows us a moment to be like, no, we're not all like that, right? And I suppose it links to Alma's earlier point that Wurche could do these things because she was of a particular class. But even in that class, there were some form of like trying to take away her freedoms, but she basically claimed those freedoms for herself.
So I think it was also a nod to women in history and women around me and in my society that I see doing this every day. I'm thinking of some people here in this village and nearby in Senegal, which is actually still quite close to the society I describe in this book, because there's certain things, like if you need to do certain things, you need permission from your husband. Like when I'm traveling with my son at the airport, I'm asked, do you have a letter of permission from your husband to take the child out of the country? And the same question is not asked of my husband. So this is a society that is still quite patriarchal, and yet I see women here who are like throwing their middle fingers at the system, and they're like living their lives and carving out freedoms for themselves. And they're doing amazing things, fighting for the rights of women every single day. So it's a nod to women like these who have existed forever. And you see them in stories like Yasantua of the Asante. And the other person I wanted to talk about is Nana Asmao, who is a poet, writer, translator, teacher. And she's the person on whom I based Jaji's character. And she lived in the early 1800s. Her father was Usman Damfodio, who waged a jihad. He thought that the Hausa kings in northern Nigeria had, lost their minds and were living heathen lives. So he waged this revolution. And his daughter is Nana Asmao. So you'd think a figure like that would want to, keep his daughter caged in, and yet she was teaching women. It was, yes, about Islam and about being a good wife and X, Y, and Z. And yet she was doing all these things, translating her brother's work. So she was also revolutionary, and she was also taking things to herself, because there were moments when I think her father wouldn't want her to go out and do this kind of work, but she would do it, and she would say, look, we'll have protection, we'll travel in groups, we'll make this thing happen. So it was a nod to women like that who have existed, and I wanted to shine a strong light on them because, like you said, history leaves them out. This woman is a case in point, because there were European travelers to her region at the time, and not a single one of them mentions her. Not a single one. Yeah. So
there are some really complex characters in this book, okay? And I did say, Ayesha, that you put me through some things in reading this book. And one of the people who put me through a lot was Morrow, right? Morrow, I'm still deciding if I think he's trashy or not, or just like how trashy I think he is, right? Because he is trashy, but I'm still deciding how trashy he is, But I mean, Morrow is a complex character, and so many of the characters in this book are that way. They actually force you to sympathize with them, even though they display some problematic traits. I mean, Morrow is descended from slaves. He knows what it's like for people to have been enslaved, and yet he actively participates in the slave trade. But he also displays principles that people would not ordinarily display in his position. So Morrow is complex, but he's trashy. Yeah, I think. And I think that there is a negotiation that the reader has to do with a lot of your characters, because so many of them are so flawed, right? Wurche can imagine that she wants freedom, right? But not finds it difficult, but yet she keeps Aminah, she buys Aminah, right? And there's something to be said about wanting to have your own freedom, and yet actively participating in somebody else being denied their own. And so many of your characters do that. So you have like a very interesting relationship with all of them. And so I want to know why you decided to write your characters as so complex, right? Particularly in us discussing really what is an ethical, I guess, a question of ethics when you think about slavery, that in itself is already in many ways just, and then you have these characters that that also just do a lot. So I want to know about that, what that meant for you to write these complex characters who actually force the reader to make some of their own negotiations.
But I mean, like, I think I did some self-work. I think people are complex in general. You find yourself in situations, making certain calculations, and sometimes it's in self-interest, sometimes you're thinking about your family, sometimes you're thinking about, okay, I'm doing this for the greater good. So people, we come that way, we're made that way. But the institution of slavery was fascinating because even when it was abolished, the characters and the kinds of thought process that brought with insane. Like, even in this region, the French had this system in place where I guess they were colonies, but not quite at that point. Their outposts were places where everybody who came had to be a free person. So there'd be people, this is Africans around them. This is in West Africa, right? There'd be African kingdoms around them where the institution of slavery was practiced. So some of these enslaved people would escape from the African kingdoms into the French outposts to be free. So France at this point has abolished slavery, and yet these people who came into this region would be followed by their masters, and their masters would come and say, hey, you're taking my property, like, pay me or give me back my slaves. And the French didn't want to disturb their trade partners, because we're trade partners with a lot of these African sovereigns. So half the time they would end up giving back the enslaved people to their masters. And this is a country that had abolished slavery. So the whole thing was very complex, very, very complex. And so in writing about it, I think I wanted to show that complexity and that it wasn't as binary as we'd like to think about it. Like, these people are bad and they're selling off these people. There were a lot of livelihoods involved as well. And same thing in Ghana, like when slavery was abolished, a lot of the Africans asked to be paid because they were losing their economic sustenance. So we don't agree with the system now. We can stand here and say, this is bad, this is evil. But I think at the time it was a lot more complex than we realize. So I think in writing the characters of Wurche and Moro especially, because those are two people who are deeply involved, either buying or selling, and in close proximity with Aminah, and yet who come to sort of love her as well, have to have mind shifts about what it is they're doing, or have to question themselves about what it is they're doing.
I think it's interesting that you said that about the French involvement, right? Because I think of Helmut in the book. Helmut is another one. There are many others. But Helmut is another one, right? In many ways, he's a site of defiance for Wurche, but that's a different conversation altogether. That Wurche acts in defiance, and Helmut is the site at which she acts in defiance. But she makes an interesting observation about how the involvement of Helmut, and I guess, Helmut is in many ways a figure for the colonizers, is also then changes the ways in which the trade begins to be shaped, right? And there's something about how when we have these conversations around African complicity in the slave trade, it almost seeks to absolve the people who came onto the continent and then also participated quite actively in growing the trade. And so I think that it's interesting for me that relationship is something that explored as well in the book, right? That there is this colonial implicity that you explore, that also not only changes the way in which the trade is done, but also grows it and just transforms it into something other than what it has been.
And at the point Helmut appears in the book, the trade is actually actively being abolished by French, the British. They've abolished it in 1804. This is like 1890. So they've tried over and over and over again. So Helmut, I guess he's also a stand-in for like that sympathetic European who's supposed to believe in the rights of freedom, or of people's rights to freedom. And yet, why is he there? Why is he in the interior? He and his people are slowly trying to lay track to like be extractive in this region as well. So he's another one. Like he says, you guys should end this thing, but why are you here? Why are you burning down our villages too? So yeah.
Strategy.
Yeah.
I suppose we can open up for a bit of questions, because, I definitely want to talk a little bit about the book coming out in October.
Okay, yeah.
Definitely want you to just read to us just, the first page of the 100 Wells, just for anybody who's watching and who's like, okay, I love this conversation. I just want to see if I can get it. But I think there's one question, Alma. I'll hand it over to you to ask some questions, the questions that are posted in the Q&A, and maybe read some of the comments that may be there as well.
Why are you handing over this to me? But okay. I'm thinking about the twins. Okay, so this question says, I'm thinking about the twins Hassan and Hussein. Oh, my girls. Dreams, visions, and hope. What did writing that particular bond mean to you?
So, dreams, visions, and hope. Has this person heard about the deep blue between? Because I think I can marry the two topics. Because the twins, they were just my everything. I come from a family of twins. My last name, Attah, actually means twin. My nephews are twins. I can see the bond is like, even when they were babies, one would cry and the other would crane his neck and look out for his brother. And so I wanted to explore what splitting that would look like, because that's what the institution of slavery did to people who had been walking the same path ever since they were conceived in the womb. And suddenly, like, they were rent apart, and what would that look like? And I couldn't stop thinking about them and couldn't stop thinking about them. So then when the opportunity came to write a young adult book, I was like, can I just explore what happened to the twins? So that's how the Deep Blue Between was born. And it follows Husseina and Hassana. So Hassana, after she has this dream about her sister, it follows her journey into the Gold Coast. And then Husseina, ends up in Lagos and then in Brazil. So it's their journey to find each other, and their journeys through these also developing areas. The Gold Coast is slowly being colonized by the British. Same with Lagos. And then there are returnees from Brazil coming in. So there's all this movement of people. So that's to give you a taste of the Deep Blue Between.
Ooh, yes, young adult, it's the twins.
Yes.
So we're definitely excited about that. Ayesha, may we please ask you to read the first page of 100 Wells? If you have your Bibles, open to the first page.
Reading from Aminah, chapter Aminah, verse 1. The caravans could come at dawn. The caravans could come when the sun was highest in the sky. The caravans could come when midnight had cloaked everything in velvety blue. The only sure thing was that the caravans would come well before the end of the dry season. But now that had changed. For weeks, Aminah and the rest of Wurche were not even sure the caravans would come at all. Even though rain clouds had not yet emptied, lightning lit up the sky in the distance and thunder boomed. The grass had already started to grow tall, and there was talk of horsemen getting closer. Horsemen who razed everything to the ground. Horsemen who scared of the caravansary. Horsemen who stole people. It wasn't a good sign. Aminah's father needed to go to Jenne to sell his shoes. Aminah's family needed to sell their food. Stop there.
Yes, thank you so much. Oh,
No.
see, now you're giving me goosebumps, and I'm like, okay, maybe I must, set up some time to read this
in my
again.
field all over again.
Actually, this has really been a wonderful, wonderful conversation.
Too.
I think from the Cheeky Natives, we want to say thank you for writing the 100 Wells. I think we need more historical fiction that's complex, right? Because that's what we get from the 100 Wells, that there's just a complex history in the interior lives of people who were part of that time period, but also part of the slave trade, and what slavery meant for their lives and what freedom may have meant for them. So we just wanted to know, where can people get a hold of you if they want to follow you, if they want to find out more about your next book?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for having me on, and thank you for the close reading, for the analysis. I really, really enjoyed this chat. And if people want to learn more about my work, find me. I'm on Facebook at Ayesha Harruna Attah. It's my name all joined together. And then on Instagram at Ayesha H. Attah. So my Instagram is a lot of food and toddlers, or one toddler in particular, and gardening. But sometimes I talk about book stuff. Yeah.
And your latest book is out soon. So where can we expect it? Tell us more. How do people pre-order the book?
So right now, I know that October 15th is the UK release date, but it's going to be coming to the continent soon. I will have a release date for that soon. So follow me on the handles I gave you to find out more about when it's going to be available on the continent. Because for me, as an African writer, my books have to come home. Otherwise, it's just not acceptable.
I think we're just making a commitment that maybe in 2 months or so, we'll be back here having a conversation about the twins.
For the day. Yes.
Because honestly, we've enjoyed your writing so much. I think that oftentimes we speak about the stories, but I also want to commend you on the writing. There were moments when I had to sit back and be like, okay, yes to this sentence, and go back to it, because I'm like, this is really what, this is it. So thank you really so much, Ayesha.
Thank you. And I have to also say I had a wonderful team behind me with Bibi, Bakari Yusuf of Cassava Republic, and yes, having Bibi edit this book was really, really, really wonderful for me. So it takes a team. It takes a team as well.
Yes, this has been such an amazing conversation. Thank you so much. I can't wait to travel to New York to get the other cover.
Coming up soon.
I'm speaking it into being. But thank you so much for what has really been an amazing conversation. I think that in the age of the diaspora wars and all of the confusion and I guess all of the misunderstanding, I think that in many ways this book can begin a conversation for us to begin to meet each other at a place of understanding, at a place of empathy, but more importantly at a place of hope, right? I'm really excited for the young adult book coming out soon.
A book I hope that's a bridge. It's my bridge book.
I love this like young age stuff. Like it's the best. When I was growing up, it wasn't that long ago, but we didn't have enough YA books, right? You were just reading people whose names shall not be mentioned because they're transphobic, and others, But I think it's beautiful for us to really start to see ourselves in the pages, but also start to see our stories and historical fiction written with such care. Because in many ways, this goes against the idea that Africans did not have a history before colonization. So people came and wrote us into existence. And the care and the detail that this book has been written with is in many ways an act of resistance and an act of writing against that historical amnesia that so many people suffer from. So yes, thank you. And thank you from us. We're so excited.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Everyone.
Bye.